Povodom obilježavanja Dana Republike Srpske u Banja Luci boravi Džozef Šmic, američki pravnik i nekadašnji visoki zvaničnik Ministarstva odbrane Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, član projekta Oversight, koji ima značajno iskustvo u oblasti sankcija i nadzora rada američkih institucija. Kao jedan od rijetkih Amerikanaca koji direktno i bez posrednika sagledava političke i institucionalne prilike u Srpskoj, njegovi stavovi izazivaju posebnu pažnju. Mr. Šmic, welcome, and it's good to see you in Republic of Srpska.
Hvala.
You arrived in Republic of Srpska a few days ago. You attended the Christmas Eve liturgy at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Banja Luka, along with other meetings during your visit. What are your initial impressions?
My initial impressions are I feel very much at home. I'm not an Orthodox Christian, I'm a Roman Catholic. And so I wasn't quite sure how to anticipate it, but I was surprisingly welcomed and I felt very much at home.
Right. You are maybe very few of our audiences know that, but you are one of the few advisors of President Trump during his last mandate. Can you tell us what was that like? How is it to work with President Trump?
Yeah, it was a quite unique experience, and I was one of the first 5 foreign policy advisors in 2016. So we were a group of advisors helping a candidate who nobody thought would ever win. So it was a little bit, how should we say it, like sort of David versus Goliath. We were taking on the huge monster institutions in the United States, but it was a very refreshing message coming from the candidate who is not only a good speaker, but I can tell from personal experience, he's a very good listener.
Right. Well, he is a politician who likes to say that he's fighting the deep state and fighting the establishment. Maybe now he has more insight in how the system works. So can we feel that he will have more space to go on with his plans and decisions in this mandate?
Yes, whenever you're engaged in politics, like in warfare, it's important that you understand both yourself and your opponents. I mean, that's military strategy 101 from Sun Tzu. Right. And Donald Trump came in as a very inexperienced politician. He had great experience where it's most important to have experience in the American business, the free enterprise system. So in that respect, he knew himself very well and he knew the American people very well. He got to know the American political system very quickly and in a very difficult way during the first term. He is much more experienced now, and we are very hopeful that he will be much more successful in his second elected term.
Having all that in mind, it is for us it is really interesting and important to have you here in Republika Srpska. You are one of the few prominent Americans who actually attended the observance of the Republika Srpska Day, an event that has for years been the subject of negative media portrayal in Bosnia and Herzegovina, European Union, even the United States. It has been disputed even by the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a body widely viewed as heavily influenced by the office of the High Representative, in part because the date coincides with the Orthodox feast of Saint Stephen. Now, from a constitutional perspective, can a historical identity or public commemoration be regulated or invalidated by judicial or administrative decree?
Under American constitutional law, that would be unconstitutional. My understanding is that the same principles that underlie our American Constitution underlie the European Union and underlie the Dayton Agreement. For instance, the principle of subsidiarity, the principle of self-determination, where the people are entitled to elect their representatives, They're entitled to have their government. It's not a foreign government imposed upon them, it's their government. My organization, the Oversight Project, has a subtitle, It's Your Government. So this principle is something that we hold very dearly and we protect. And whenever we see violations of this principle, we try to shed light on the facts.
Well, we can say basically the Dayton Peace Agreement is an American product. The Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina is widely based on American type of law and judiciary practice. Now, what would happen as an American citizen? How would you personally respond if an international foreign body attempted to prohibit the celebration of July the 4th, your Independence Day?
I would feel I would feel shocked, I would feel invaded.
Right.
If a foreign entity tried to tell me as an American that I cannot celebrate 4th of July, I would feel like I've been attacked by a foreigner.
Yes. Well, they're trying to dispute the date itself, even though it's a historical event. It actually happened on January 9th, 1992, before the war even started. So that's maybe, how do you feel as a legal expert for those who try to dispute that?
Yeah, well, you know, the facts are facts, and I wasn't here on January 9th, 1992.
Right.
And as a Christian, by the way, we recognize St. Stephen Protomartyr just like the Orthodox do. So any American who was aware of criticism of government activity because of a recognition of a Christian saint, that would be very un-American.
Well, we in Republika Srpska like to say that many of our problems with the U.S. administration came from the previous Biden administration. Now, there's an ongoing debate in the United States regarding the use of the auto pen for signing executive orders and presidential actions. From the standpoint of constitutional accountability, how problematic is it when sanctions are imposed without a clear, direct exercise of responsibility by the elected president?
Yeah, that's extremely problematic from a constitutional standpoint. We have one of our core principles in America is individual accountability and the rule of law under God. And for somebody who is not empowered to exercise a presidential power to authorize an auto pen, we would call that in constitutional parlance, we would call that void ab initio, a nullity. It's as if it never existed. Now, I want to make clear that there could be instances where the previous president actually directed the use of his auto pen. We've done extensive research at the Oversight Project. We can't find too many of those. There aren't very many instances where there is a clear trail where President Biden made a decision and directed that his auto pen be affixed to a document. If that evidence is lacking, then any presumption of government regularity has already been displaced. There's no presumption. If the evidence isn't there, then there's no presumption. And I believe, as a constitutional expert, those documents, whether it was a sanction or a pardon or an act, should be treated as nullities, as if they never existed.
Well, does the sanctioning of elected officials based on their constitutional interpretations amount to interference with the democratic will of the voters?
Yes. And we've seen that happen in the United States. We are quite familiar with unelected officials who have usurped powers that they have not been given by the people. And when that happens, that's an abuse of authority. When I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to serve as the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, the largest Inspector General organization by far, if you include the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps, literally twice as big as all the other Inspector General offices combined. And one of our mandates was to look for and to root out fraud, waste, and abuse of authority. That's what an inspector general does. Right. When an unelected bureaucrat exercises authority that he or she has never been given, then that's called abuse of authority. And that's when people like inspectors general, like the Oversight Project, need to come in and shed light on the facts so that the American people can have accountability for how their money is being spent by their government.
And we are talking about the US-based control, but how would you respond if a foreign government sanctions one of the US elected officials for policy disagreement with the federal government?
Well, I mean, that's happened before, and we just simply reject it. I think when I was Inspector General, my boss, Donald Rumsfeld, was sanctioned by the European Court, and somebody tried to tag him as a war criminal, and we just simply ignored it. It's like, that doesn't happen. Now, the more interesting question is what happens if that foreign entity is being paid for in part by my tax dollars?
Right.
Well, then we just can't simply ignore that. That's abuse of authority, and that's abuse by a government official of my tax dollars. And that becomes very personal for Americans.
Right. Based on your experience, to what extent is US policy toward the Balkans still shaped by outdated assumptions rather than current political and institutional realities on the ground?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of education that needs to be done in the United States, frankly, because, you know, once you get outside of the Washington Beltway, most Americans don't really get involved in foreign policy. It's usually left to the government in Washington. Mm-hmm. And mostly we have been very deferential to our government on how our government deals with foreign policy. Now, the whole AutoPen scandal has shaken that trust. Right now, I believe the American people are very hungry to find out exactly how the AutoPen was used and by whom. Literally, we are asking questions like, which live body in the White House actually directed this sanction or this pardon or this law to be signed? And if the answer is anybody other than the president, then, as I said earlier, then that legal action becomes a nullity. It's as if it never existed. We don't recognize that under American law.
Well, there are certainly changes in the U.S. foreign policy. Just recently, Secretary General Marco Rubio announced that U.S. will withdraw from, I believe, 66 foreign organizations because they just don't seem to see the point of U.S. being there. Most of them are from the UN, even from European Union. Is that a significant change in foreign policy?
I think it is. I think it is because for decades, ever since World War II, the United States has been mostly through executive action, sometimes through congressional action, but the United States has been involved, if in no other ways than funding many of these organizations. And I think the American people now are becoming very skeptical and wondering, how is our money being spent? Exactly how is my dollar being spent in this international organization? And if there's not a good answer, I would say stand by. We're going to see some plugs being pulled.
Yeah, we've seen that in the case of the USAID being cut off from the funds and realizing that there were billions and billions of dollars, US taxpayers' dollars, being spent even here. We've seen many NGOs and USAID who work here and got plenty of money, but with no real results.
Yeah. No, you know what? Every time light is shed on how American tax dollars are being spent, if there is action to correct that, and there's abuses all the time, I know from personal experience, but whenever we shed light and we expose how tax dollars from American people are being spent, it increases the confidence of our people in our government, and that's a good thing. We shouldn't be naive about it. I mean, people do bad things, okay? Even good people sometimes do bad things. But the issue which we need to do is we need to not be naive. We need to acknowledge that, to fix the problem, and get on with addressing the challenges that are more important.
Well, you've had some time here to spend in Republika Srpska. You've been with our leaders, with the people. Firsthand, how do your impressions, political, institutional, and leadership related, compare with how Srpska or the Serbs are typically characterized in Washington policy media?
I have to tell you, I've been very impressed with President Dodik. I met him first on Christmas Eve. We just exchanged pleasantries, but I had the honor of having Christmas Day dinner with the president. We were able to talk very freely, and I was so impressed that President Dodik on Christmas Eve would actually post on X a very sound spiritual message for his people that this is Christmas. This is the birth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I told him when I had dinner on Christmas Day, I said, you know, that courageous act of leadership we don't see enough in the United States. That was for me, that was a real act of leadership by a Serb that we in America should take note of, and we should do more of that in the United States.
Do you see any parallels between President Dodik and President Trump? They're both from the business world. President Dodik was a successful businessman before he entered politics. They're all straightforward, thinking and talking kind of men.
I see a lot of parallels. They're very, number one, their business experience. Number two, they're very smart. And number three, they're just good people. You know, I served President Trump in 2016. And as I said earlier, my first impression was, this man not only speaks well, he listens really well. That's a very, very important attribute of a leader, to be able to listen, to think beyond himself. I mean, President Trump likes to talk about himself, and that's fine. I mean, he's a successful businessman. That's kind of who he is. I accept that. It's not exactly my style, right, but I respect that. And President Dodik is not the same in that way. President Dodik actually seems to be a little bit more subtle than Donald Trump, but I think as effective. Every style of leadership is different. The most important, I think, for me as a leader, and I used to say that when I was Inspector General, is you can't fake leadership. And that doesn't mean that every leader is exactly the same, but what I see in Trump and what I see in Dodik is the same type of real, honest-to-goodness leadership.
You were a really important man in the Department of Defense. You were in the Office of Foreign Assets Control.
Actually, I've worked with the Foreign Assets Control Office. Okay. I wasn't in that.
Right, but you know how it functions, how it works. Yes. You now are a member of the Oversight project. Did anything you saw or heard here materially challenge the prevailing political and media narrative about the Republic of Srpska in the U.S.? Because regarding the sanctions, our leadership repeatedly said that those sanctions were imposed simply in terms of hearsay, not based on real evidence. That's as far as we know.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that I think we still need to shed some light on is President Trump lifted the sanctions that were imposed by the auto pen in the Biden administration. That's good. But my understanding is that there are still some very real sanctions on President Dodik. For instance, he's not allowed to serve in government, supposedly, for another 5 or 6 years.
6 years, yeah.
And where did the authority to impose that sanction come from? Was that sanction indirectly paid for by American tax dollars? And why is that sanction, if it was paid for directly or indirectly by American tax dollars, why wasn't that sanction lifted?
Well, in fact, it is in part or mostly paid by the American tax dollar, because the Office of the High Representative is financed through international community. We all know that it's mostly from the US, and the person who represents himself as the High Representative, Christian Schmidt, the German politician, gets really good paycheck for what he does. And what he did was imposing laws without the parliament, imposing laws simply by making them official on the website. You are a legal person. How do you even come around that?
Look, I used to teach constitutional law. This is my specialty. But every man-made law has to have 4 essential attributes. It has to be a rule, as opposed to a judgment, of general applicability, prescribed by the sovereign.
Right.
Okay? When you look at these sanctions that are still on President Dodek, I asked myself, well, it's not really a rule, it's not of general applicability, and it hasn't been prescribed by the sovereign. It's, in constitutional parlance, it's a nullity. And on top of that, it's contrary to the action of our president to lift the sanctions off of President Dodek. I think, frankly, and I'm hoping that my organization, the Oversight Project, sheds some really bright light on how U.S. dollars are being expended to impose such a lawless sanction.
Can we hope that the American administration will do something about it, that this country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, stops being a protectorate? We are aspiring to be a EU member. We cannot go to EU if we have Office of the High Representative with those powers.
Look, the Office of the High Representative was imposed by Dayton. But the powers being exercised today, my understanding were in a sense self-created or created by the Bonn process or something other than the actual legitimate treaty. At some point, the treaty may morph into something else. I mean, if Bosnia and Herzegovina is admitted to the European Union, it's a real question, do we still need the peace treaty, or should it be replaced by something else? But, times change, and it's been a long time, and abuses have happened, and I think we just need to shed light on exactly what the facts are. And if the facts are ugly and they come to the attention of the president, I can assure you President Trump will take action. Well, I'm not speaking on his behalf.
Right.
But I just know that's the type of guy he is.
Well, as I said, the Dayton Peace Agreement, it's an international treaty. The Constitution is a part of that agreement, the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. If constitutional arrangements are altered without the consent of all the parties that signed the treaty, does that still constitute the rule of law or something fundamentally different?
That is lawlessness. International treaties are fundamentally contracts between and among international parties. If at some point the one or more of the parties is not in agreement with the way that the contract, the compact, the treaty is being carried out, of course that party can withdraw or terminate and frankly, if the party is not allowed to exercise self-determination, and if the treaty itself is being violated, well, we get into a situation that we had a civil war about it. We call it slavery.
Right.
We don't like slavery in the United States. I mean, we've been there, done that. And now we believe that even contractual partners that have made an agreement, if things have changed or if somebody is abusing the powers under that treaty, well, then we call that breach. That's a breach.
Yeah.
And the parties that have been injured by the breach have the right to terminate the agreement or to get restitution or somehow to remedy that. And in the end, it may be that the agreement is terminated or, not by the action of the victim, but by the action of the parties that have abused powers.
Well, the leadership of Republika Srpska maintains that Dayton has been undermined through imposed decisions rather than formal constitutional amendment procedures. There are hundreds of laws imposed, hundreds of parts of, for example, constitutions being changed, altered by force by the high representatives, this one and the ones before. From legal standpoint, would you characterize this as a constitutional evolution or erosion?
I would say erosion. We have seen that happen in the United States. We have seen the Constitution of the United States amended by judges. And that is always a problem. I mean, anytime an entity, whether it's a duly appointed judge or a bureaucrat, tries to amend the Constitution in a system that's illegal. That's ultra virus. That's not authorized, and the people in the end will not tolerate that. In the United States,
right.
We in the United States, that's happened very recently by the U.S. Supreme Court, and then in the last few years, the Supreme Court has rectified those past abuses and has actually acknowledged that these abuses occurred and has taken action to get us back on a straight rule of law basis.
Is there any democratic country in the world, or let's say the U.S., where there is an institution that exercises such powers without meaningful judicial review or democratic accountability?
In the United States, there is always judicial review for abuse of authority by executive or by legislative officers. The tricky challenge is, well, what happens when the abuse of authority is by the judicial authority? That's tricky because the judiciary, it's human nature. It's very difficult to judge yourself. But it has happened recently in the United States. We have seen the Supreme Court come back after decades of lawlessness and say, nope, we had no authority to do this. We're going to reverse decades-old decisions, and we're going to return the power to the people and to their elected representatives, not to unelected judges.
Well, but it would probably be impossible to imagine that a transnational institution or a foreign individual comes and removes a democratically elected, let's say, mayor or governor in the United States. Is it? Well, can you even imagine?
Well,
let's say someone from I don't know, UN.
They tried to remove President Trump in his first term. That didn't work. They went through an impeachment process.
But
twice.
It was all inside the American institutions.
But that itself was lawlessly enacted.
Right.
There were no real charges of serious impeachable offenses. They made those up. It was in many ways an abuse of that process. And in any event, it didn't work. And then during the Biden administration, the Biden Justice Department tried to prosecute the former president to prevent him from becoming president again. And that didn't work either. So there are attempts, there have been attempts very recently in the United States for unelected bureaucrats to affect the will of the American people, and the ultimate power that the American people retain to elect their own president.
Right.
And we thank God that we have been successful that far. There's no guarantee that it won't happen again, frankly, and it requires leadership and courage by people like President Trump, people like President Dodik, to stand up and actually say, that's not right. We're not going to tolerate that.
Do we need more leaders such as President Trump, President Dodik? Here in Europe we have Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, Slovak Prime Minister Fico, and others who tend to see Europe as a community of sovereign nations rather than some huge globalist organization.
Well, I mean, the good thing for Europe and for the United States is the very foundation of Europe is built upon the principle of subsidiarity. Just like the U.S. Constitution, the final provision of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, codifies the principle of subsidiarity for Americans. And subsidiarity is a very powerful principle. It literally is what Charlemagne used to pull Europe together. It allows decisions to be made by government officials at the lowest level possible, so that government official feels the brunt of his decision. Right. And that principle underlying that my understanding is that is holding the European Union together. If that principle gets eroded, it's not going to be pretty for the European Union. It's not going to be pretty, just as in the United States if that principle gets eroded.
Well, how do you see, let's just divert for a second, European politics and their leadership now? We see from one side President Trump trying to get things done, trying to get President Putin on the negotiating table to arrange some kind of a peace deal in Ukraine. But we also see European leaders who are actually saying that they are preparing for war. But who actually runs in Europe and in European Union? Those are not elected officials, those are appointed officials.
That's a very serious question.
Right.
I don't know. I'm an expert on the US Constitution. Mm-hmm. What I've heard about the European Union and the actual live bodies that are controlling the European Union autopen. Right. Those live bodies, people should know exactly who they are, by what authority, and for what purpose they are doing everything they're doing. And my sense, just talking to some Serbians on this trip, is you have the same challenge in Brussels that we have in Washington. And sometimes these decisions are made by people that are not elected, and they're made behind closed doors, and those people are not accountable. We call that the deep state. I mean, I don't typically use that term, but I hear it a lot even over here. Those are people who are making decisions that affect your and my lives, and maybe without authority. And if they're acting without authority, that's an abuse, and that should be investigated, and people should shed light on that. And I'm hopeful that my organization, the Oversight Project, either directly or indirectly through partners in Europe, will help us as like-minded individuals who love liberty, trust in God, and just want their families to have better lives, that we'll come together and we'll deal with these challenges intelligently. But it will take courage. It will take. I can tell you from personal experience. You do that in Europe, like what I did in the United States, you will be attacked. People will accuse you of all kinds of things. Right. You will literally be putting an X on your back. So you need to band together with like-minded individuals. You need to understand the dangers, and you need to take those dangers on courageously, and trust in the Lord that in the end, even if you fail, you're going to be engaging in a righteous effort.
Well, you said you are a devoted Christian. We are here a Christian nation, Christian country. Can we hope that you will spread the message in the US where it's needed, so that important people hear that there is a small nation here that actually is a staunch defender of Christianity?
Yeah, you know, we are seeing, and I'm engaged in a number of organizations to protect Christians around the world.
Right.
Because, frankly, there is a lot of persecution of Christians going on today. Now, we're not talking about the first century or the second century. We're talking about the 21st century. And we Christians, and it's not just a Christian issue, we have fellow believers, even some good Muslims and some Jews, and we need to band together and protect each other, because these forces that are persecuting Christians are also persecuting other believers because they believe in God. They're basically anti-God evil forces.
Let's end with the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina. How do you, in your view, how do you see the long-term stability of this country? We have on one side the leadership of Republika Srpska saying, okay, look, we have the Dayton Peace Agreement, we have the Constitution, let's stick to that. How it's written, it offers plenty of space to all three nations to exercise their rights. On the other side, we have politicians in Sarajevo who said, oh no, we need a centralized country, we need more foreign interference, we need more imposed sanctions, decisions, and so forth. How do you see Bosnia going forward?
You know, my answer to that question is something that I've repeated a number of times, but it's the guidance of Pope John Paul II when communism was lifted off the shoulders of the Ukrainian people. And a friend of mine met with him in Kiev and said, Holy Father, what guidance do you have for the Ukrainian people? And this is my same answer to you with regard to Srpska and Bosnia and Herzegovina. We need to do three things. Number one, we need to align ourselves with like-minded individuals. Number two, we need to try to work within the system if we can. And number three, never give up hope, because you are a soldier of Christ.
Well, Mr. Šmic, I thank you for your time here in Republika Srpska.
It's a pleasure.
Poštovani gledalci, gost Radio-televizije Republike Srpske bio je Džozef Šmic. Vama hvala na pažnji. Ostanite uz naš program.